Hello. Welcome back to Music 110. So, in this lecture video, we will be taking our first step into the depths of the digital audio workstation. We'll be looking at waveform techniques. In other words, how you can manipulate and modify a waveform within a digital audio workstation. Over the next 3 modules, we will be continuing our exploration of the digital audio workstation and looking at other techniques. So we'll be looking at how to use effects, how to change volume and panning over time. We'll be looking at how to mix. And all of this over this module and then the next 3 are about preparing you for your next creative project. So I thought we should look at the prompt for the next creative project now, so that we can be thinking about this as we go over as the class continues over the next several weeks. So in module 8, the sound collage project will be due. And this is what I'm asking you to complete. So, use a digital audio workstation to compose a sound collage that incorporates at least 3 sound sources. So, sound sources in this case being sound recordings. So 3 separate sound recordings that you found, probably on the internet. This composition should demonstrate your ability to splice audio into smaller pieces, shift the pitch of audio, stretch or compress the time of audio, create a signal chain that includes multiple effects, automate changes in volume and panning, and use multiple audio tracks. So those are all of the techniques that you need to demonstrate that you're able to accomplish in this project. In addition to creating this piece of music and submitting the audio file, you will also write a reflective essay on your process. In this document, detail the techniques you practiced and explain how and why you used the particular technique. For example, why did you shift the pitch of a recording down? What musical relationships were you trying to create between your chosen sound sources? What about extra musical or rhetorical relationships you created? In other words, how are you telling a story? How did the process of exploration and improvisation within your DAW affect your decision making? So you're submitting both the audio file and a reflection on the process of making this piece of music. So the first thing you might be thinking is like, okay, so where do I find these sound sources? That's totally up to you. However, I highly recommend that you create a free account on the website freesound.org. And what this website is a massive database of crowdsourced recordings of all sorts of things, and all sorts of qualities. Let's take a look at it really quickly, and I'll kind of take you through why I think that this is such a useful resource. So here I am at freesound.org, and I already have this search term in here, right? So I've created my account, and now I can search their database. I just put in garbage truck. So let's see. Let's yeah, let's do that again. A garbage truck. So what is great about this website is that it's so massive and so many people have contributed to it that even a specific search term as specific as garbage truck has given me 189 potential sounds. So now that I have this list of recordings that are tagged with garbage truck, I can go through and I can audition these recordings. So the first one sounds like this. It's kind of quiet at first, so maybe I'll skip to the louder part of the waveform here. So yeah, now I can go through each of these and see which of these have the best sound. What are some sounds that I think I could would be really productive or would be useful in my project. Another thing that you can do in helping yourself filter out these this large list of sounds is to filter out by file format type. So I would recommend only searching for WAV files. I'm going to click that now. And I can also filter by sample rate, and that will help a little bit. By filtering by sample by WAV file, I'm assuring the higher quality of sound, and by filtering by sample rate, I might be able to do the same thing. But now, now I can just kind of go through all of these garbage truck recordings, maybe find a couple that I like, and then because I've created my account, I can download these straight onto my computer and drop them into Luna or into whatever digital audio workstation that I'm using. Great. So now let's get to the topic at hand. We're going to be talking about waveform techniques in the digital audio workstation. And to give us a little I think it's helpful for us to have historical context with these waveform techniques. So first, let's talk about the origin of these waveform techniques that we're going to be practicing in the digital audio workstation in the analog recording studio. So how a lot of the terminology and a lot of the visual thinking that you're going through when you're playing with these waveforms comes directly out of the history of the analog recording studio and the use of magnetic tape in particular. When I say waveform techniques, I'm talking about processes that we apply directly to waveforms. There are other you will learn very soon that there are other processes involved in mixing, in mastering. There are all sorts of other processes that happen with audio. Right now, we're just focusing on processes that we apply directly to the waveforms themselves. These processes include splices, fades, pitch shifts and speed changes, time stretches, reversing, gain adjustments, and what is called normalizing. So I'm going to cover all of these, demonstrate all of them within Studio One today, and by the end of it, you should have you'll have a bunch of techniques to play around with as you start collecting audio, dropping audio into Studio One, and toying around with it and experimenting. So I'm encouraging you to, after you've viewed this lecture, to get some audio, getting some audio into your into Studio One, and just kind of start experimenting and see what you come up with using these techniques. So all of these techniques
are applied directly to waveforms, but they also have a pre-digital history. So what is that pre-digital history, and why am I bringing this up? I think that if we understand the way in which these different techniques and the terms that we use to describe them when we're working within a digital audio workstation, as derived from analog techniques, it becomes easier to conceptualize what's going on when we're performing any of them. So, what is the pre-digital? And of course, as we've learned so far in this class, when we say pre-digital history, we're really usually talking about analog, the analog history of waveform techniques. Well, it all goes back to a razor blade. So these techniques are all derived from physical processes that people did when they edited and edit, because people still do this craft, analog magnetic tape. So the reel-to-reel tape that recording was done on before computers kind of took over, and the way that edits were performed were with a razor blade, with just a simple razor blade here. So how did that work? What we see here is a splice. We see two reels of tape, right? One on either side. We see a razor blade. And then these reels of tape are going through this metal groove here that you can see. And you can see that the reel that is on, looks like, yes, the reel that's on the right is going through this groove on this metal plate, this metal block, and it's laid over the top of the reel of tape that is on the left. And they both are going through this groove, and somebody has lined them up. And then you have these two sort of, one is diagonal and one is perpendicular, smaller grooves. Now, those grooves are there so that you can make the exact cut that you want and have it be the same cut on both reels of tape. So the razor blade would fit into either of these grooves, whichever one you want, whatever type of splice you wanted to make, whether it be a hard splice, which is the perpendicular one, or a soft splice, which is the diagonal one. So that way you're making an exact cut so that both reels, the two reels of tape that you are splicing together, are cut in the same way, the same angle, all of that. So what ends up happening then is you cut at that point, and then you literally tape them together at that splice point. To give you a sense of this, here is splicing in action. What we call this grooved piece of metal is a splicing block. Now, these two, it's hard to tell on this particular splicing block here, but it's easier to see on this one. There are two types of splices here. Sometimes a splicing block will have up to 3 or 4, and if you have more than 2, it'll just be more angles. So you'll have a 90-degree angle, like is seen here, and a 45-degree one, but you might have maybe a 30-degree angle and maybe a 20-degree angle, something like that. And the different angle is going to determine the length of the crossfade between the two splices. So imagine it like this. The tape is going by, just like a record is rotating. The tape is going by and is being read by a sensor. And if you're splicing these two pieces of tape together and you splice them at an angle, as the tape passes by the mechanism that reads the tape, it's going to read, if we're going in slow motion, it'll read just a little bit of the tape on the right and a lot of the tape on the left. And as it goes through that splice, if it's a splice at an angle, you will crossfade from tape A to tape B, depending on how much of the spliced together tape, how much of it at any given moment is taken up by A or B. So these angles are crossfades. And the reason they're crossfades is because the tape is going by at a consistent speed. If you have a 90 degree angle, there is no crossfade. It just, the tape goes by and it immediately switches from one recording, one take, one piece of audio to the other. If it's angled, then it's going to have some amount of crossfade. So, so splices and fades grow directly out of razor blade technique for magnetic tape. Reversing, pitch shifting also comes directly out of reel-to-reel tape. This would be much more intuitive, I think, right? So if you're going to pitch shift something, you're going to slow down the speed of the tape. If you are going to reverse something, you just change the direction of the tape. So all of these techniques are actually derived directly from reel-to-reel razor blade editing, or just reel-to-reel tape editing techniques, except for normalizing. And I'll explain that when we get there. So all of these are derived directly from analog techniques, and I think that will help you as you are trying to remember the difference between the techniques and as you are practicing them yourself.
So now let's see how all this happens in a digital audio workstation. So I'm going to be working with the recording that I'm having you all download in this module for the discussion post, where I'm asking you to chop and screw a breakbeat. So I've downloaded the breakbeat from Brightspace, and I've dragged and dropped it into Luna. And this is the same breakbeat that I'm asking you guys to tinker with this week. So what I'm going to do is just use this breakbeat, and I'm going to go through each of the techniques that we just discussed. So we're going to look at splicing, we're going to look at fades, pitch shifting, time stretching, and gain changes. Okay, so first things first, I've got this breakbeat into Luna. Let's just listen to what it sounds like. All right, so after I pressed play and I was tracking the playhead across the waveform here, across my audio clip. I have this audio clip here that I'm dragging, and within the clip, we see these shapes, which is the waveform. So as I'm watching the playhead go across the waveform, I'm taking note of which sounds are correlated to which shapes within the waveform. So as I'm listening, I'm thinking, oh yeah, okay, there's a kick drum, there's a snare drum, there's some hi-hats, there's also like a bass and an organ in there. And not all of these shapes within the waveform might have just one of those sounds, two of those sounds, three of those sounds together. So as I'm watching, I'm thinking like, okay, which of these shapes do I want to do I want to splice out and maybe repeat, manipulate, turn into a new rhythm? So I'm going to press play again, and then I'll probably stop before we get through the whole thing. And I'm going to be looking for maybe I want a kick and a snare to start with. So I'll press play. All right, great. So this third shape here was a snare hit. So I want to isolate that. I want to pull that out of there and be able to manipulate it. So what I'm going to do is put the playhead right kind of near the beginning of that shape, and I'm going to zoom in. And the reason I'm zooming in is because I'm going to put a slice as close to the beginning of that snare hit as possible. And the reason I want it to be at the very beginning of the snare hit is because wherever I put, when I copy this out or cut this out, wherever I put it, I want it to know. I want to know that it's starting right at that moment on my timeline. So I'm going to zoom in really close, and we can see the wave. Now that we're zoomed in really close, we can really see the waveform as wiggles in the air. So these wiggles to the left, let's put the, if I were to, yeah, these wiggles that are sort of to the left of the playhead here are maybe bass drum dying out. You can see that the wiggles are becoming less and less and less. And then right here, around about, is right where this snare hit happens. So I'm looking for when the air, the wiggles in the air, start to increase, and wherever that is the beginning of this snare hit. So I'm going to put the playhead right at the beginning of that snare hit, right? And now let me zoom out a little bit. All right, so now I know that where I have my playhead, it's right at the beginning of this shape. And notice that when I zoom out, like it's harder to know exactly where your playhead is in relation to the shapes. So it's a good idea to always be zooming in and zooming out as you're doing these techniques and doing this sort of work. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is a splice, and there are a bunch of different ways to do it in Luna, and in all digital audio workstations. They'll give you maybe keyboard shortcuts, or you can access it by going to an edit menu. What I'm going to do is, this is a really, I think, cool, useful function that Luna has. While I'm working with audio, if I go over to where it says workflow here, and I click on these stacked horizontal lines, this will toggle edit workflow. And what this is going to do is, bam, it gives me this toolbar, right up top, and this gives me all of these buttons. All of these functions that that will happen depending on where my playhead is and what I've selected in the audio. So, in order to create a splice, this waveform, I'm gonna, wherever my playhead is, if I press separate, what will happen is it separates whereas before I had two audio clips. Now I've I misspoke. Whereas before I had only one audio clip, now I have split that audio clip into two. And if you imagine, one way to think about these audio tracks in a digital audio workstation is they're kind of like tape laid out flat, right? like this audio clip that I've selected, you could imagine it as a tape that you've laid out flat on a table, and that you could now make a razor blade slice to. So that's what I've essentially what I've done by pressing separate right here where the playhead was. So the playhead essentially becomes a razor blade, and now it's separated this clip into two. All right, let's zoom back in because I want to get just the snare. I don't want all this stuff afterwards. And what I see is a tiny little shape here, which is probably a hi-hat. So I don't want that hi-hat sound. I just want the snare. I'm going to zoom in again, and you can see that it's a lot easier to get this really precise once I've zoomed in. I'm going to do the same thing where the playhead is. I'm going to press separate. And again, just a reminder, the way I got these buttons up here on this toolbar was going to the workflow area and pressing this button, the vertically stacked horizontal lines. Now, I'll zoom out one more time, and now what I have is just one snare hit selected. If I press play, we should just hear a snare hit loop. Great. Okay. And if I remember right, there's a single bass drum maybe here. Okay, that has a bass drum and a hi-hat. What I'm looking for is a bass drum totally by itself. I could really, actually, this is a bass drum all by itself here. So that I'm going to zoom in on the wave shape that came right before our snare drum. And that's really convenient because I only need one splice now. And the reason is because I made this splice right before the snare drum. So I'm going to zoom in a little more, make sure that this is precise. Beautiful. Zoom out a little bit. Press separate. Okay, so now I have created one of the things I've done by splicing here is I've turned one audio clip into now 4. I can rename my new audio clips. So I can rename this snare. And the way I did that is just double clicking on the clip header right there. So I just put my mouse over the clip header and double clicked, and this allows me to rename these clips. And now what I've got is 2 separate clips that I can duplicate, that I can move around, that I can play with. And to make this easier on me, moving around these individual bass, kick, and snare hits, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new track. And the reason I want to create a new track is I just want some empty space that I can move stuff around. I can shift things around. So I'm going to go track, new tracks, and I'm going to title this. I'm just going to title this chopped beat. And this should give me a new track underneath, chopped beat. And this will allow me to I can drag both of these clips down into my new track. And this will allow me to drag these individual hits, these individual shapes, to new places on the timeline. the reason I'm leaving, this is just something I do when I'm working in this way. The reason I'm leaving this second track is so that I can go back, and grab other shapes whenever I want to add something new. But since I'm going to be listening, I want to start like messing around with just these two clips. I don't want to hear this first track that I'm kind of like that I'm leaving there because I'm going to select things from it. It's sort of like my palette, so to speak. So since I don't want to hear this right now as I'm listening to these sounds, the kick and the snare that I separated out, that I spliced out, what I can do is mute the track that had the entire breakbeat. And the way that I mute a track is just by clicking M. And so now, if I loop this, we should only hear the kick and the snare that I spliced out. Now, if I unmute this top track, you can hear the difference. Okay, so I'm gonna leave this top track muted, and we're just gonna and I'm gonna kind of shrink it because I'm not really gonna be paying much attention to it right now. And we're just gonna focus on using this chopped beat track to manipulate, further shape these waveforms that we selected out. So first off, you will have noticed that I have not been in snap to grid mode. The way that the timeline is operating right now, wherever I drag these clips, that's wherever I drop them, that's where they're going to land. So let me get this. Let me get a loop going again, and so you can hear as I was moving the snare around that I'm able to drop this snare wherever on my timeline, which is great if I, for example, like let's say I'm working on material that isn't precisely rhythmic. Maybe I'm creating a soundtrack for a movie and I'm using different sounds. And I really want to be precise about timing when things start in relation to what happens in the film. But I can also, if like let's say that I want to make something that's clearly rhythmic, and in this case I do because I'm chopping and screwing a breakbeat. So what I can do is turn on snap mode, and that's going to snap whenever I move this clip. It's going to snap to the grid. So see how it just kind of like suddenly shifts from one of these lines to the next one? And what this is doing is it's keeping all of my clips on a consistent, unchanging amount of time. And in this case, that unchanging amount of time is controlled by the beats per minute, or the tempo of the track. And the way that I can change the beats per minute is by changing this number up here on my top toolbar under BPM. So in order for me to demonstrate this, let's go like this. We're gonna listen. I'm gonna let it loop, and then I'm gonna shift the snare around. But this time, because it's snapping to grid, you should hear a different. It would be much more clearly regular in terms of how the time is being divided. Okay, so now one last thing about snapping to grid. The grid, uh, the frequency of the grid lines is controlled by uh, this grid button here. So let me move this over here. Pay attention to the grid lines here, and as I change the setting on the grid button, this will change how frequent the grid lines happen. So as you can see, the grid lines and the numbers that are correlated with them work just like a ruler, right? Like if you're thinking in terms of inches, a half inch is longer than a quarter inch, is longer than an eighth of an inch, is longer than a 16th of an inch, et cetera, et cetera. So, think about the grid in terms of like a ruler, and the more the higher you go up with your denominator here, the more fine-grained the grid will be. Okay, so here's another cool thing about snapping to the grid is let me loop this. So since this is now snapped to the grid, when I change the tempo, it's going to keep it'll keep the time relationship between my two clips the same so that I can slow up or speed down the tempo. Right now, I've set it up so that in this loop, the snare drum happens at the beginning, and the kick drum happens at the very beginning of the loop, and the snare drum comes in the exact middle of the loop. So see if you can hear that. So that means when I decrease or increase the tempo, this this time relationship of like something happening at the very beginning and then something happening at the very middle will stay the same, but the rate at which the grid is going by, or the rate at which the pulse of the music is going by, is going to change. So listen to that as I change the BPM. Okay, so you can go back and forth between using the grid or not using the grid. Using the grid can be very useful, especially when you're trying to make beats. All right, so we've talked about splicing and how you can put these. What is useful about the splice, right, is we know that each of these sounds starts exactly where the splice is, and so wherever the splice, wherever, that means that wherever we're putting these sounds, it's exactly on a grid line, and so we know, okay, that snare is going to hit right at the exact halfway point in this loop. All right, let's talk about fades now. So if I zoom in on this snare hit, okay, so here we have this single clip, and if I hover my mouse just underneath the header of the clip, as you can see right before where we have this waveform window, the icon of my mouse switches from your sort of like text cursor to this sort of diagonal line, and that lets me know that right where my mouse is, I can now affect a fade. So let me just show what happens. So I'm going to grab this with my mouse, and I'm going to pull it to the right. Okay, there we go. All right, so this is creating a fade. Now, you'll notice that I'm in snap to grid mode, and so the fade Well, first let me say this. Okay, so what as you can see, I created this fade, and the shape of the waveform changed dramatically. When there's no fade, we see the very beginning of this lots of energy in the beginning of this snare hit, and when I put this fade on here, you can see that removes a lot of that energy. So let's just hear what that sounds like. Okay. So I'm going to press play again and let it loop, and I'm going to take the fade off. So what the fade is doing is it's fading in. It's like a volume fade coming in, right? Now, I'm in snap to grid mode, which means I can only create fades that snap to these grid markers. So this is why it's useful to go back and forth between using snap to grid and turning it on, turning it off, because if I turn it off, now I can be really precise with this fade, right? I could just have a very quick fade. Whoops. And I'm going to let this snare loop, and I'm just going to change the length of the fade so that you can hear the difference. Okay, so I can create a fade on the left side, which would be a fade in, and I can also create a fade on the right side of the clip, which would be a fade out. Now, what you'll notice is this is exactly like doing a diagonal cut with a razor blade on magnetic tape. So, right, like I would be cut, like this would be a diagonal cut with my razor blade. But what in digital, we can do a lot of things other than just a diagonal cut. So we can change the shape of this fade, right? By dragging it around. So in order for us to really hear that, it would be a lot easier to hear it on the fade in. So let me loop this, and then I'll be adjusting the shape of the fade in different ways. Okay, so so this would be really useful, right? In terms of if you want, if you have this, especially fading out when you are creating these splices and these clips. Sometimes there's a lot of sound on the other at the end of the clip, and it sounds really unnatural the way that it ends. Let's pull out another sound where that might be more obvious. So it might actually happen with this kick. So yeah, let's take a listen to the kick that we spliced out, and so as you can see, so what I can do is I'm going to shorten this. Let's imagine that the kick we spliced out, like the snare came sooner, and so there still is like sound going on in the kick, right? So if I press play, this would be a good candidate to put a fade out, to have a more natural, to have this get the clip go to 0 here, so we don't have an abrupt ending. Okay, so we've covered fades. Next, let's talk about crossfades. So, in order to demonstrate this, I'm going to I'm going to splice out another portion of this break beat here. And I'm just going to do something at random. And the reason I want to do that will be apparent soon. Okay, so I'm gonna pull out two random parts of this breakbeat. And so here are the two random parts of the breakbeat I pulled out. And okay, first off, Luna, like most digital audio workstations now, has something that's called non-destructive editing, and what that means is that each of these, for example, I've been I've been splicing out of this main audio file or this clip. Now, if I hover my mouse over the bottom corner, what happens, you'll see that like the icon of my mouse switches to this kind of bracket sign. And when it's a bracket, I can drag this clip and it remembers what came before, right? So this is non-destructive editing. Luna remembers like, oh, this is from this particular audio file. So I just look back to the audio file itself, and I know exactly what the audio information is. Notice that. So I'm dragging from the very end of the audio file here. It will not let me drag any further. I can drag in, but I can't drag any further than here because this is the end of the audio file itself. So it's non-destructive, but it's not creative, right? It doesn't generate new audio. Now let's look at these two random clips that I pulled out here, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to drag this second clip so that it overlaps with the first. I'm going to select both of them, and that will allow me to loop these two together. So you can hear exactly where this splice point between the two clips is. Now, so I have these two clips butted up against one another. If I highlight a region over a region that overlaps with this splice point, and then I go up to my workflow buttons here where I was able to press separate, and I go all the way over to fades, and I press crossfade or X-fade. Watch what happens. Okay, so what this did is it created two overlapping fades on these two clips. The first clip fades out, while the second clip fades in. So I'm going to loop these two so you can hear the crossfade. And I can adjust this. I can adjust this crossfade. Say, maybe I want it to be not so long, and I want it to do something like that. And I think you can hear that this made this transition between these two much smoother, right? It sounds much more natural than before. So that is a crossfade. In other words, we have two clips, and and one fades out while the other one fades in. The reason that this can work this way on a single track is because we don't have destructive editing. Luna remembers that this clip, if I were to select just the first clip, that what happens after the splice point, it remembers the other audio information that continues. Likewise, the second clip, it knows the audio information that came before this splice point. So when I create this crossfade, Luna can reference the audio file to know how to fade one out while you fade the other in. All right, next let's talk about pitch shifting. All right, so now we're going to get into the weirder stuff. Let's go back to our bass and no, actually, let's use this. Let's use a bit with the organ. So I'm going to pull out a bit with the organ that's maybe a little longer from above. Something like this. I can always copy and paste also. So what I just did is select and copied and paste, and so I didn't make a splice. All right, so I've pulled out this clip, and we're gonna mess with it to demonstrate pitch changing. So here's what it sounds like. Oh, forgot to mute the other track. Okay, first, to pitch shift. When I'm looking at this clip, I can pitch shift directly from the clip header. It says 0.00 semi, and what that is semi is short for semitones. A semitone is the distance between two adjacent keys on a piano in terms of pitch. So another way to think of it would be like do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do, from ti to do. So I can shift the pitch of this clip just by clicking on the semi and moving the number up to positive or negative. Positive would be to shift the pitch up. Negative would be to shift the pitch down. So I'm going to loop this, and I'm going to start messing with the pitch shifting. All right, so you will have noticed a couple of things. Not just that the pitch was going up and down, but as I was increasing or decreasing the pitch, the rhythm or the timing did not change. The timing of this musical phrase did not become faster and slower. The timing stayed the same, but the pitch changed. So that's important to remember. If we were changing the pitch using magnetic tape, we would be slowing down the tape. We would have the tape, or like a record. Think of a record playing slower. The pitch goes down, but also the speed goes down too. Here, pitch and speed do not have to be connected in that way. So that's how I would change the pitch of my clip. If I can also double click here and put the value in with my keyboard. I'm doing that here, so I know I go exactly back to 0. Now, so that's shifting the pitch. Next, let's talk about stretching and compressing the time of the clip. Now, the way we can do that in Luna, it's going to be very different depending on which DAW you're using. But if you're using Luna, this applies to you. So what I can do is I can switch the view on the track view. So over here on my tracks, you'll see there are different settings that I can change. And one of the settings that I can change is my view. So if I click on this, this opens up this window over here, and this allows me to switch from clips to warps. So I'm going to do that. So I've switched the view on my chopped beat track to warps. I'm going to close this. So now this clip itself has a whole bunch of information that Luna has automatically put into it. We're just going to explore one aspect of this today, and that is the main carrots on the outside of the clip. What I demonstrate today, you can also apply using these smaller carrots within the clip. So that would be something you should experiment with and have fun with. You'll notice that Luna automatically found where a new hit happens. So they've put these carrots here on every hit within this waveform, and that allows you to manipulate it in all sorts of ways. I encourage you to sort of mess around with that. I'm not going to speak a lot about these carrots here today. I'm really just going to talk about these outside larger ones. So if you remember before, I was able to change the length of the clip like so by dragging the bottom right corner. And what that does is it makes the clip longer, and you'll see that new audio information emerges, right? Because it's non-destructive editing. It's like, oh, well, here's the next things that happen in this particular audio file. But while I'm in warp mode, if I drag from the top now, this top carrot, remember before when I was able to create a fade and my cursor turned into one of those diagonal lines, and now it turns into this bracket with something in the middle of it? So in warp mode, if I drag to the right, okay, see what's happening? It's not revealing the sounds that come later. It's stretching the waveform. All right, so I've now stretched the waveform, and let's press play. So, and you can hear the tempo has slowed down. I can stretch it further. And I can also compress the time of the clip. So, sounds more like a punk song now. All right. Now, so this is how you can stretch and compress the time of a waveform in Luna. There are different algorithms that will treat the stretching differently. And the way we can switch between them is switching between different warp modes. So I'm going to loop this. I'm going to switch to different warp modes, and then we'll talk about some important differences. Let me get this. There we go. Okay, so there's a clear difference in the sound, right? And when I switched from polyphonic to varispeed, now with the varispeed setting, we get that slowed down record effect where the pitch and the speed of a sound are connected. So let me play that again. Now we're in varispeed warp mode. So yeah, you get that kind of slowed down record, that kind of chopped and screwed sound quality. But these different algorithms give you different results. So I recommend you, when you're experimenting with stretching the time, to just listen to the different effects of these different modes and see which ones sound interesting to you. All right, last topic is gain. So we've talked about so far. We've talked about splicing, fades, crossfades, pitch shifting, and time stretching. Now let's talk about gain. If we go back to my kick and snare at the beginning here, and I'm gonna get out of warps mode. I want to go back to clips mode here. All right, so if I'm listening to this, I might say, this sounds okay, but I can, even just by looking at it, I can see that the snare drum is louder than the kick. That the energy of the snare drum is just, the waveform goes higher than the kick does, and the kick just sounds quieter. So one thing I can do to get the sounds to be more even would be to change the gain setting on the kick. And the way that I would do that is to so here in these clip headers, right? So over here is where I would change the pitch semi, right? And if I move over here to this, I mean, it looks like a fader, like a tiny little fader. If I click here, this will allow me to change the gain. Now, what I'm doing as I increase the gain here, you see the waveform grow. So think of gain as like, it's like water pressure in a pipe. So as I'm increasing the gain, it's like I'm increasing pressure in this pipe, and it's making all of the wiggles wiggle further. I'm putting energy in, right? So the wiggles that were there before, that is this kick drum, as I increase the energy, as I increase the gain, the time at which the wiggles happen does not change, but the distance of the wiggle does. So the speaker is going to wiggle in the same way. It's just going to wiggle further out and in as a result of increasing the gain, or less as a result of decreasing the gain. So I can increase the gain, and now maybe I have a better relationship between these two sounds. So I'm going to loop this and change the gain on the kick so you can maybe get a good sense of what's going on here. You'll notice that I had both these clips selected, so the gain was changing on both. So I need to make sure that just one clip is selected here. Okay, so you'll notice that when I really started increasing the gain a lot, you might have noticed that these red lines showed up on my master over here and in my track. And what those red lines mean is that I've increased the gain so much that the waveform is going past the limit. So of how far the speaker can go, or the speaker can go in or out. So in other words, let me zoom in here. I'm not gonna press play, but you can see visually what I'm talking about. So watch as I increase the gain. Eventually, those peaks will hit the outer edge and they'll start to square off. And what that would create would be distortion. That's how distortion works. You're squaring off waveforms. And this would also be something you would call redlining. So when a sound redlines, it means that it has reached the limit of output for the particular channel. Now sometimes distortion is a desirable effect, but that's just something to keep in track of, and we'll talk a lot about that when we talk about mixing. All right, so this should get you ready for chopping and screwing a breakbeat. Just to take us back through all of the topics I just demonstrated, we spliced, we faded, we crossfaded, we shift the pitch, we stretched and compressed the timing, and we changed the gain on individual audio clips. Have fun messing around with this breakbeat and creating a new music out of it, and I look forward to hearing what you come up with. See you next time.